here who teaches me Talmud and knows and has gone through most of the Talmud in depth, that it would be a much bigger treat for the community to actually hear from an expert. So without further ado, I want to introduce Rabbi Ari Taback to the community and thank him so much for joining and being part of this. It means a lot. And I really look forward to a beautiful shir together. And yeah, it will be totally awesome. I'll start recording now as well. And I hand it over to you without further ado, Rabbi Taback.
Great. Thank you so much to Rabbi Avtzon. It's really my privilege to be here. And the truth is that I feel humbled to have someone like Rabbi Avtzon on our program. I don't see him as a student, but very much as a colleague. He's a Torah scholar himself, and it's amazing to have someone like him learning with us. And we have wonderful interactions. We communicate. He sends me messages, ideas. So it's really a privilege for me. And just to say how fortunate I think you guys are to have a rabbi with his energy and enthusiasm and his commitment to developing himself and continuing to learn. So really, it's my privilege to be here tonight. What I'm going to do is share with you my screen as well. I want to show a few slides to you and just to explore the subject of Talmud. As Rabbi Avtzon described, it's something that I'm involved with, and many people dedicate a lot of time to studying Talmud. And our question will be really to try and understand why it is that we put such an emphasis on Torah study in general, and more specifically on Talmud. If you give me a moment, I'm going to share with you my screen. And what I would like to do is tell you a little story, because what you see in front of you, what you should see in front of you, can I get a thumbs up from anyone? You can see it? Great. So this is actually a little nugget that I found in a history book about Rabbi Avtzon mentioned that we're related. We're married to first cousins. My wife and his wife are first cousins. And this is actually a story about their grandfather's grandfather. They share a grandfather's grandfather. So we're talking 6 generations back. And this is an article that was shown to me. It comes from the Golden Years memoir of Old Rustenburg. And it describes my wife's grandfather's grandfather, whose name was Noah Kirsch, who came to South Africa from Lita. And I want to read it to you. You can read it yourself with me. It says, in all his daylight hours, Noah Kirsch wore a yarmulke and regularly performed his daily prayers in his shop with his magnificent beard, his tefillin, and it explains what they are, on his forehead, and his large prayer shawl wrapped around his shoulders. His Gentile customers were so impressed that he was known as the Yuetza Father Christmas, which they translate here for Rabbi Avtzon because he's not familiar with Afrikaans. But while it says here, and this is really the point I wanted to bring out, is that while waiting for his clientele to enter his place of business, he would always be seated behind a small table, constantly studying the Torah and the Talmud in both Hebrew and Yiddish. He was a most devout and observant Orthodox Jew. And for me, this was a glimpse into the past, and it was a taste of our ancestors, the ones that arrived here from Lita. Some of them, many of them still had a connection to that deep study of Torah, and not just the study of Torah, but specifically the study of Talmud. And I want to try and understand, why was this such a central part of their lives and continues to be such an important part of our lives as well? I want to bring out another example of this, and this is a story about this particular person. This is one of the great Jewish leaders of the recent generation. He passed away a few years ago. His name was Rabbi Yosef Shalom Eliashiv. He died at the age of 102. When he passed away, I wrote an obituary for him in the Jewish Life magazine. And in that article, I started off by describing his morning routine, where he would drag himself out of bed at 2 a.m. every single morning. He would force himself out of the bed, and he would quickly roll up his blanket so that he wouldn't be tempted to get back into the bed, and he would splash his face with cold water so that he would be wide awake. And this was his daily routine. And this was his daily routine for decades. And in fact, over the age of 100 years old, he was still following this routine, where he would be jumping out of bed with tremendous energy to get to the base midrash, to the study hall. He actually used to study there was, if you've been to Meir She'arim, in the back alleys of Meir She'arim in Jerusalem, there's a small shul called the Oil Sarah Shul. And he sat in the Ezras Nashim, in the women's section of the Oil Sarah Shul through the week for hours and hours a day. He would lock the door, and that was his seclusion, and he would study Torah for many, many hours a day. Now, what struck me as astounding was to have a man at the age of 102 living with so much purpose. You know, to have something to wake up for, something that you're going to drive yourself out of bed to get going, to be energized, to be able to have something with such purpose is quite astounding. And that's really what we're here to discuss tonight, is what is it about the Torah that is so core and so important to us that at the age of 102, you have a man like Rabbi Elyashiv who is still motivated and is still driven because this is the most important thing for him to be doing. If I may just pause for a moment, I see we've got a lot of people on the line and not so many people on the cameras. Obviously, those that are able to, it's always nice to see faces in this day and age. Obviously, no pressure if it's not a good time for you, but it really gives people a lot of chizuk. I say that in all my shirim today because we're obviously living in times where even when we go out into the street, we're not seeing people's faces, unfortunately. So it's wonderful to see people's faces. The point that we're saying is there's something about Torah study that is deep inside the Jewish blood and that drives us with so much energy. And we're trying to understand what is it about the Torah that is so central and so important to us. You may have seen an image like this in recent times. This is an image from the MetLife Stadium with close to 90,000 people celebrating the completion of Shas, the completion of the entire Talmud just at the beginning of this year. We also had a celebration over here in Johannesburg. And again, this is something that is a movement. This is something that is so core to the Jewish people that this was a celebration, a national celebration of the fact that these Jewish people had studied for seven and a half years these 2,711 pages of Talmud. Some ancient book, an ancient text. Which other nation is involved in such an activity with so much passion, so much energy, so much effort being expended? And really fascinating also to see that we're talking here about one of the generation's leaders. This was a great rabbi, and this is talking about the masses. This is for every single person, every man on the street. There's something about studying Torah that is so central. And we want to try and explore what it is about the Torah and specifically the Talmud. Now, if you take a look over here, this is just actually a little a progress tracking card that we made at the beginning of this current cycle of studying the Daf Yomi to track how one's doing. And you can see over here that there are actually numbers for each of the pages of the Talmud, 2,711 pages, depending on exactly how you count them. Those are double-sided pages. So we're talking about over 5,000 single-sided pages of dense text, which is exceedingly complex. Now, I must tell you that the Daf Yomi program is quite a novelty. It's something new. To study an entire page, an entire double-sided page of Talmud every single day was a novelty of the last 100 years. And in previous generations, it was unheard of. In previous generations, you studied the page of Talmud as long as was necessary until you had completely understood it. And it wasn't necessarily measured by quantity as much as quality. For various reasons, historic reasons, it became necessary for the Jewish people to establish a quantum of how much you should do every single day. And this has been something that, in a sense, has saved the Jewish people because it ensures that people, no matter what they were going through, whether it was the Holocaust and all the subsequent travails that the Jewish people have experienced, this program happens to be one very powerful program that has kept Jewish people studying Torah every day. Because if you don't put in that 45 minutes to an hour a day, so you're not going to keep up because it is so intense. But that being said, those that have been to yeshiva will know that a single page of Talmud, often in yeshiva, we would spend weeks on a single page of Talmud. There is enough content and depth in a single page of Talmud. So that is a little bit about the program of Daf Yomi, but that's not really what we're here to talk about tonight. I want to understand, why is it that this is so important? What is it about the Talmud? Now, when I speak about this, I like to actually use this expression. Sometimes I'm tempted to put it on a poster or an advertisement, but I'm a bit wary because maybe it can be taken as flippant. But my intention, the meaning of this question is, why on earth? Because we're dealing with something that is divine. We understand that the Torah comes from a higher place. And why on earth? Why are we studying the Torah down here on earth? And there's two parts to this question that I want to address tonight, and that is why Torah, and secondly, why specifically the Talmud? The Talmud is just one example of Jewish literature. We know that there is the Tanakh, the Bible, which consists of the 5 books of Moses, and then we also have the writings, the prophets. We have the entire body of oral law that was kept in an oral tradition form for many, many years until eventually some 2,000 years ago, it was written in a very terse form in the Mishnah. And then that was subsequently elucidated further, where more of that body of oral information was put into a written form in the Talmud. Why are these so central? And again, just to realize that picture that I showed you earlier of Rabbi Eliashiv, when Rabbi Eliashiv's father passed away, his father predeceased him by 69 years. When his father passed away, Rabbi Eliashiv took over a Talmud shir, a Gemara shir, that he was giving to regular working men in the neighborhood of Mei She'arim in Jerusalem. And he gave that shir for nearly 7 decades. For 69 years, he gave that shir into these men, a group of about 14, 15 men that used to come, and he missed it on a very few rare occasions under extreme extenuating circumstances. It's an astounding thing, the level of engagement and commitment. You know, when I studied in Israel, I studied in Israel first as a yeshiva bachur when I was single, and then subsequently after I was married. And there's an entire society that is built around the study of Torah. This is not just a pastime. This is not just something that one does on the side. You know, there are people there. We had neighbors. They lived in the apartment building together with us. You know, we were just newly married. We had 1 child. We took the largest apartment in the building because we were from South Africa. The smallest apartment in the building, which was like a 2 or 3 bedroom place, was a family with many children. And the father was studying intensely. He was studying Talmud. This was a man who was sitting in the base midrash on a wooden bench for up to 12 hours a day. And then on the bus on the way home, he continued studying. Now, this is the person that wants to continue doing what he's doing on the way home when he's been active in it the entire day. What is this? It's almost, and the word that I want to use here, and I use it cautiously, is this obsessive engagement with the Torah, and why exactly do we do it? So the answer to that question, and the answer to this question always, when a person asks about any mitzvah, when we come to question why it is that we do anything, the first answer and the go-to place is simply because Hashem said so. And that is really a very important starting place. We are Jewish people. We have received the Torah. We received the Torah at Har Sinai, and the Torah comes with 613 commandments. And one of those commandments is to study the Torah. So as a go-to place, or as the backstop, so to speak, to answer these questions, why do we study Torah? The answer is because Hashem said so. You have to speak to your children about the Torah. And we know that it says that you have to study the Torah, and you have to study the Torah intensely. The pasuk says in Sefer Yoshua, you have to engage in Torah study day and night. And that is the obligation of a Jew. And more than that, we know that the Mishnah, it's something that we say in our morning prayers every single day. The Mishnah says, the Talmud Torah keneged kulam. That Torah study is the greatest mitzvah that a person can engage with. Before we come to any other reasons of why we study Torah, the answer is because Hashem said so, and didn't just say so, but told us that this is the highest activity that a human being can be engaged with in this world. That is our go-to place to start off with. The Talmud says fascinating and astounding things about Torah study. You know, the Talmud in Maseches Megillah says that Talmud Torah takes precedence over any other mitzvah. And in fact, and I'll say this, it sounds controversial initially, but Talmud Torah is greater than Hatzalas Nefashos, than saving human life. Now, that's not to say that if there's a person passing away, that you would, God forbid, leave them to pass away. But if you have 2 people, one person who's not studying Torah and one person who is, the person studying and the person who's not studying Torah can go and can offer the perfect, obviously the exact required medical attention. The person studying Torah must stay to study Torah. He's better off studying Torah, assuming that the patient is being taken care of. Obviously, we would never give precedence to anything over human life, as we all know. But the intrinsic mitzvah of Torah study is admirable as a mitzvah in and of itself, keneged kulam, greater than any other activity. we can continue to this discussion as we move forward today to understand why, what makes Torah study so great. But the fact is that Torah study is the highest mitzvah activity that we can be engaged with. So that is our starting point, but there's more to it than that, and that's why we're here tonight. The next point, I would like to show you a few sources. I'm not going to throw a whole lot of Hebrew text at you, just some very short ideas. The Gemara in Maseches Shabbos, the Talmud in Shabbos says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Ma'aseh, there was once a story, Benochri Echad, with a certain non-Jew, Sheba Lifnei Shammai, who came in front of the scholar Shammai. We know there were two great scholars, Hillel and Shammai. Amar Loi, and he said to him, Kama Toiros Yesh Lachem, how many Torahs do you have? Amar Loi, he said to him, Shtayim, two, Torah Shebichsav, the written law, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and the oral law. Now, I want to explore with you a little bit what is the relationship between these two parts to the Torah. We know that even though Shammai said here, you see, Shammai answered the question and said, Shtayim, there are two, but he didn't really mean that there are two. We all know that the two parts to the Torah Shebichsav and the Torah Sheba'al Peh, are inextricably linked. There is no way to take the Torah Shebichsav, the written Torah, without the oral Torah. You know, the written Torah says, place the tefillin upon your hand and place the head tefillin between your eyes. The understanding of that comes to us through the oral tradition of exactly what that means. And in fact, there are sections of the written Torah that are inexplicable, that cannot be understood without some form of oral accompaniment that goes with it. Now, we all know that that oral tradition remained an oral body of law for an extended period of time, from the time that the Torah was given all the way through until the period of the Mishnah about 2,000 years ago. Now, I want to show you something else. There's a fascinating halacha. There's a halachic difference between the written law and the oral law. You see, this Talmud, this is a section in the Gemara in Maseches Gittin that says, Dvarim shebichsav, sections of the written law, i'ata rashai le'omran ba'al peh. You are not permitted to state them off by heart. You may not recite verses out of the Bible off by heart. You're not allowed to say them verbatim. And in fact, when the reader reads from the Torah, you know, bar mitzvah boys often they've got a lot of nerves and they're anxious, and they have to be taught to keep their finger on the place, because you have to read the text. This is the written law, and it has to be read from the text. You may not say it off by heart, even if he's studied his bar mitzvah portion very well. And then it says, Dvarim sheba'al peh, the oral law, i'ata rashai le'omran bichsav. You may not say them off by heart. That means there's an inverse relationship. You may not put them in writing. There's an inverse relationship between the written law and the oral law. The written law has to be written and may not be stated off by heart. And the oral law must be kept off by heart and may not be written down. And in fact, there is a major question as to how Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, who wrote down the oral law, wrote down the Mishnah, how he could even do that. He was in a sense breaking the law. He was breaking the halacha. And we say that was called Eit La'asot La'Hashem. It was a time of need. For the sake of saving the Torah, we're allowed to break the Torah under very extreme circumstances. But what do we see here? The two bodies of the two parts to the Torah are actually halachically defined. The one that has to be written and the other one that has to be oral. Now, based on this, you understand that they are inextricable, but they have different natures. They have different parts to them. What's going on over here is that it seems like the oral law and the written law are actually one body of information that was just really expressed in two parts that work hand in hand to form a single body of information. The question is that really the case? Look at this piece of Gemara. This is a famous section in the Talmud that we've actually just recently seen in the Daf Yomi program. This is in Gemara Shabbos on page 88. It says, Vayityatzvu betachtit hahar. The Jewish people camped beneath the mountain. Omar Rav Avdimi bar Chaso, this particular sage, Rav Avdimi, he stated the following, Melamed, it teaches us, Shekafa HaKadosh Baruch Hu Aleim Esahar Kegigis, Hashem held the mountain over them like a barrel, V'amar Lohem, and said to them, Imatem Mekablim HaTorah, if you receive the Torah, Muta, very good, V'im Lav, and if not, Sham Tehei Kvuraschem, this will be your burial place. Now this is a fascinating teaching. This teaching is telling us that God forced us to receive the Torah. It's derived from this verse that says that they camped beneath the mountain. Incidentally, I want to tell you a very beautiful insight. The Maharal of Prague, who lived about 300-400 years ago, he explains that this is not to be taken literally, that the mountain was physically held above their head. But he says that the experience of the giving of the Torah was so dramatic and it was so compelling that they, in a sense, were deprived of their free choice, as if a mountain was held over their heads. And that was part of the process of the giving of the Torah. Now, what's the problem with this section of Talmud? The problem is we need to reconcile it with something else we know. We all recently had Shavuot. Unfortunately, we weren't able to read the Torah in Shul. But the reading of the Torah in Shul, we say the Jewish people accepted the Torah and they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, kol asher diber Hashem, Na'aseh v'nishma. It's actually not in the reading on Shavuot morning, but it's in Parshas Ki Sisa. The Jewish people said, Na'aseh v'nishma. This was a statement of absolute undying commitment to the acceptance of the Torah. The question is like this: how do you reconcile this? This piece of Talmud is telling us that they were forced to receive the Torah, and yet we know they said Na'aseh v'nishma. How do you reconcile those two teachings? There's an amazing midrash. The midrash says that they wanted, with all their hearts and with all their souls, they wanted to accept the written Torah, but they did not want to accept the oral Torah. That's what the Midrash Tanchuma says. Which is a bizarre thing. I don't understand, what does that mean? The Midrash says that they were delighted, they were enthusiastic to accept the written Torah, but they didn't want to accept the oral Torah. So my late teacher of Aaron Pfeiffer, Zatzal, used to live here in Johannesburg, passed away some 30 years ago. He said the most fascinating thing. The Jewish people wanted to accept the Torah, but they wanted it in written form. That means, you want me to put on tefillin? Tell me to put the tefillin on my arm, on the muscle, at exactly this place, and tell me to put my head tefillin above the hairline, exactly where it needs to go. Don't make it so complicated. Why do we have to have a written Torah and then the oral law that interfaces with it? And the battleground in between these two bodies of information is where there is a massive amount of toil. The Jewish people were saying, give it to us as a written Torah. 3.2.1, wear tefillin. 3.2.1a, put the tefillin over here. All the details, just tell us what to do. And Hashem said, by your lives, I will not give it to you in that way. He, so to speak, held the mountain over their head and said to them, you accept the oral Torah as well, and that involves toil, that involves engagement. Hashem understood that the secret of Jewish continuity was that the Torah has to be dependent on us, and we have to be dependent on the Torah. This is an astounding idea. I'm not sure if people are familiar with computers. I'm not a big expert, but I understand that there's two types of memory in a computer. There's something called RAM and there's something called ROM. The RAM is a temporary memory which the computer stores information on while it's busy processing things. And then as you power down the computer, or if there's some load shedding, the RAM empties out of all of its memory and there's nothing there. But the ROM, your hard disk, is what retains the information and is a fixed body of information even when the power is off. You should know that the written Torah is the ROM. That means the written Torah is a body of text that you put it on a bookshelf and you come back tomorrow and that body of text is still there. The written Torah is a static reality that will always be there. We have the Torah. We have the Torah in the Ark. We have Chumashim. We have it all over. And yet there's a body of Torah that is RAM. What does it mean that it's RAM? It means that it needs power. As long as the power is switched on, that body of Torah exists. If God forbid for a moment the Jewish people would stop studying the oral Torah, the RAM, that information would disintegrate, which means we are inextricably linked to the Torah itself. We become one with the Torah as we study the oral law. Hashem understood that to give the Torah to us didn't just mean to hand us a book to put on the shelf. Hashem understood that to give the Torah to us meant giving us a share in the creation of the Torah itself, in the sustenance or the sustaining of the Torah itself, that it exists inside the Jewish people. And the truth is that it is the Torah that has sustained us for every single generation. The fact that we are sitting here at the very end of this long story, of this long exile, please God, it should end soon with all the difficulties that are in the world today. The fact that there are still Jewish people here at the bottom tip of Africa, despite what we've been through, even in the last 100 years, it's entirely miraculous. And it's because we have a life force inside of us that is divine, that is from a different reality. The question we asked at the beginning, why on earth? Hashem has given us this Torah, which actually gives us a spark of divinity and keeps that spark of divinity alive inside the Jewish people. That is what the oral Torah is. Now, the oral Torah consists of many details. The halacha, Shulchan Aruch, there's nearly 2,000 chapters of halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. There's many, many areas of Torah. But the Talmud, and specifically the Babylonian Talmud, is at the interface between the oral and the written law. And it's there where all of the action, all of the toil, all of the hard work is in order to create and to sustain the Torah. The correct way to study is we need to place ourselves in that interface. We need to put ourselves into that realm, into that womb where we are actually creating Torah in a sense, and we toil over there. That is where we toil. Now, we go in both directions. It's an amazing thing, and I love doing this when we study Talmud together. On a single day, we are going, it's time travel. We are traveling across millennia. We start off with psukim that were given at Har Sinai in the year 2448, and we're now in the year 5780. We understand that in the course of a morning study, we're going to read some of those psukim. We're then going to see some of the commentators, and we're going to see the Mishnah 2,000 years ago, the Talmud 1,500 years ago, the Gaonim 1,000 years ago, the Rishonim 800 years ago, the Achronim 400 years ago, the modern commentators 200, 300, 100 years ago. What you end up with is a spectrum and a connection and an unbroken chain all the way back to Har Sinai itself. And that is the beauty and it's the joy of studying Torah. So this is briefly a picture of the generations of the Talmud. This is the Tanaic period. You can see over here the year 3750 from creation. It says here, the creation of the world, the year 3750. So it's almost exactly 2,000 years ago. Here is Hillel and Shammai, who were the first two of the scholars that we mentioned, Shammai earlier. And this is all of the students, the famous Rabbi Akiva, you can see here in the middle, the teachers and students all the way through the period of the Tanaim, of the original authors around the time of the Mishnah. You can see that this period ran for just around 200, I think 250, something like that, 250 years. We had the period of the Tanaim, and at the very end we have Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, who wrote down the Mishnah. And then over here we have the Amoraim, which is the next period, which was, you can see running from, I'm looking at the years here, I'm not sure if I can see clearly, but over here to the year 4200, which is almost exactly 1,500 years ago, when Ravina and Rav Ashi, they closed the Talmud, they wrote the Babylonian Talmud. So, why on earth? Why do we study Torah, and why specifically the Talmud? Because Hashem said so. And number two is because it connects us with Hashem. This is where the divine is actually brought into us, where the wisdom of Hashem actually becomes part of us. And this is an astounding process. It's actually a process that is hard to describe to anyone that is not engaged in Torah study. But this is the most powerful spiritual thing that a person can do. And I want to emphasize this because we're living in a new age generation where people are seeking spirituality, often without frameworks, without realizing that the spirituality exists on our own back door or in our own backyard. The spirituality exists in Torah. The single greatest spiritual activity that a person can engage in is not meditation, but it's the study of Torah. When a person sits down and studies Torah, and even if it might seem that the Torah is not necessarily meditative or doesn't necessarily connect in that emotional way, you have to know that that is the food for one's soul. That's not to say that there isn't meditational parts to the Torah and parts of the Torah that can give one a very deep feeling of connection, but at the same time, we know that this is the single most powerful way to connect us with the divine. I want to start wrapping up, and I would also like to take, if I want to leave some time for questions, discussion, but there's something that I wanted to add, and this has been going around in my head as I've been studying recently the Talmud, and that is studying Talmud shapes our inner sense of truth. And this is something that I can't emphasize strongly enough. There is an astounding power to learning Gemara that shapes a person's sense of integrity. You know, when we study Torah, there's something that people don't realize. You know, those 2,711 pages of Talmud all have to be reconciled one with the other. That means every single line has to be cross-referenced with every single other line in the Talmud and has to be reconciled because it is a single body of information that has to be in a state of stasis, because that is the Torah. If it was said by one rabbi over here and another rabbi over there, we have to understand, what is the debate? Why is the debate? Are there two valid perspectives to this particular issue? And there is much debate. But in the end of the day, everything has to fit together. And if something doesn't fit, there's something wrong. And if one studies Talmud, you'll realize that most of the exercise is about reconciling every single piece of Torah with every other piece of Torah. And that gives us a connection to Torah and a deep sense of truth. But it's even more than that. In our studies, I have teenage sons, and when I study Gemara with them, one can pick up on one little point, and it's an amazing thing because you can debate it backwards and forwards. And it's there's a confidence that one has that when it clicks, one will see the truth in it. It's an amazing thing. If it doesn't resonate with a person, you have to think very carefully. Why am I not making it? Why is this not making sense? You know, sometimes the kid in the class that has the question is actually the kid that understands best. One of the most wonderful experiences in Gemara is to have a kasha, to have a question, because the question is an opening to find a deeper sense of truth. And it's an amazing experience when a person clicks, when that question is answered and things fit together, and you know, the two cogs start to turn and the whole machine starts to turn, and you see how everything fits together in this most beautiful combination of all of these different elements. There is an incredible sense of satisfaction. There is a deep, and these are 2 points that are very closely related. The one is that it shapes our inner sense of truth. And the second thing is that there is no greater pleasure. There is a very deep pleasure that human beings get from experiencing the truth. When something just clicks, when something just makes sense, when something didn't make sense, and then I toiled very hard, and eventually it made sense to me, and I see that it's right. You know, it's an amazing thing. It takes a lot of humility also. Not only does it shape our inner sense of truth, but it is the most powerful tool for shaping our egos. There is no greater ego than believing that you're right. Now, when one studies Talmud, it's an amazing thing. If you go into the great yeshivas in the world, when one studies Talmud specifically, you'll see two partners studying together. You think they're about to kill each other. They're screaming at each other, yelling, red in the face, arguing. And then you go to the lunchroom and they're sitting next to each other like great friends. But in the process of fighting to find the truth, to understand what is this piece of Talmud saying? How does this fit in with everything else we know? There is a massive fight to find the truth. And in that is an incredible exercise in shaping our ego as well. So in a sense, it shapes our inner sense of truth, and that it also shapes our inner ego and works us as human beings. You know, when I wrote this article about Rabbi Elyashiv, this great scholar who died a few years ago, so I had the privilege of once seeing him in my life. I was studying in yeshiva some 20 years ago, and he came to our yeshiva for a bris. And it was the most amazing thing, because as he walked into the yeshiva with maybe a few hundred students were standing by the door waiting to see him come, they parted like it was like the splitting of the Red Sea. The crowd parted, and this man walked down with tremendous humility, but with such dignity. There was a man who was living with an incredible sense of dignity and self-control. Now, I wrote in this article, a friend of mine was once sitting at a wedding, and there was a famous psychology professor who was sitting at the wedding, and Rabbi Elyashiv was at this wedding. And this friend of mine eventually walked up to the professor and said to him, "Tell me, why can't you take your eyes off Rabbi Elyashiv? Why can't you stop looking at him?" He said, "I've never seen a human being living with such self-control." This was, in fact, his particular unique personality. Obviously, different people have different personalities. He lived with an incredible amount of control because he had been shaped by a sense of Torah study and by the truth and the process of Torah study, which shapes us incredibly. So that is, in a summary, some of the reasons why we study Torah. It's a dangerous topic because one can never really do justice to this. The simple answer is because Hashem said so. The deeper answer is because it connects us with Hashem in a very powerful way. It shapes our sense of inner truth, and this is unique to the Talmud. I must tell you that the Talmud lets us in behind the scenes. You know, there's two Talmuds. There's a Talmud Yerushalmi and a Talmud Bavli, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. We hardly study the Jerusalem Talmud. And the reason is because the Jerusalem Talmud is quite factual and doesn't allow us into the process. Whereas the Babylonian Talmud allows you to roll up your sleeves and be part of the process of fighting through and trying to get that clarity. And that is crucial to our process of studying Torah. It shapes our inner sense of truth, and there is no greater pleasure. I want to end off with just one last point, and then I'm happy to take questions. My kids came home, or they got sent these packages before Shavuot. They got sent packages from their school. And one of the things that they got was this little postcard, which I copied over here. And I want to just read to you because it's a beautiful quote. This is Rabbi Eliashiv. This is his typical pose. He was in this pose for much of his life, completely immersed in the ocean of Talmud. And this quote comes from a work called the Or HaChaim, which is actually a Sephardic commentator on the Torah in Parshas Ki Tavo, which is in the book of Deuteronomy. And the quote says, V'ein toiv ele Torah. This is actually a quote from the Talmud itself. There is nothing good quite like the Torah. The Torah is the essence of goodness. She'im hayu bnei adam margishim. If human beings were able to experience the metikus, the sweetness, the arevus, and the pleasantness, toiv haTorah, of the goodness of the Torah, hayu mishtagin, they would go crazy, umislahatin achareho, and they would be chasing after it, v'lo yechashev b'eineihem, and would not be significant in their eyes. Meloi olam, the entire world filled with kesef v'zav, silver and gold, lemu'uma, would be like nothingness. Ki haTorah koileles, because the Torah incorporates kol hatovos sheba'olam, all of the goodness in the world. And I must tell you in conclusion, after all is said and done, you will never get someone sitting for 12 hours on a wooden bench doing something that he doesn't enjoy. There is no greater pleasure. There is a sweetness that comes simply from the connection to the divine and the process of finding the truth. And it is because of that pleasure, it's really so captivating. And it is really the highest activity that we can be engaged in, to be involved in Torah study. So that was just a very brief overview, some thoughts. As Rabbi Avtzon mentioned, this is something that I'm involved in. I have a website where I teach Talmud, the Daf Academy. I'm not necessarily encouraging people to do Daf Yomi. Daf Yomi happens to be an extremely rigorous program. Doing a single page every single day is relentless. There's a vast amount of information, but there certainly are many different programs. I'm doing also on my website, I have a program of a single page a week, which is a much slower pace, but also incredibly deep and fascinating. We're studying the laws of Yevamot at the moment. So there's many opportunities. And maybe just, I know there's a further point, which really is another whole subject, and that is, where do women fit into this? So there's a resurgence of women being involved in Torah in our generation. And this is part of the Messianic era. This is something that my wife is very involved in. My wife teaches on her own school. She has an online school for women called The Nexus. And she has found, and she's tapped into an incredible movement today of women that are also connecting to Torah. Women can study many parts of Torah, but there are unique parts of Torah that women have a very deep connection to. And there is a thirst today for Torah study also for women that is being catered for, and that there are many opportunities out there. So everything we've said tonight, much of what we've said tonight, is equally relevant for men and for women. I'm happy to take some questions now on anything that I've said tonight, or general questions if anybody has.
So, Rabbi, I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
Somebody who's not comfortable with Hebrew and who's never really studied the Talmud, how long does it take for one to be initiated in this study? In other words, at what stage is somebody, even if they're not fluent, but at least could be comfortable with making it through a page?
Yes. So the answer to your question is a lifetime. I still haven't quite reached that point of being completely comfortable because the Talmud, as we've said, is vast and there's so much there. You're referring specifically to the language barrier. I'll tell you my experience, and this is something very intriguing to me, is that I find, having studied and taught Talmud for decades, especially to South Africans and to South African Balei Tshuva, people that have started to get involved at a later stage, who don't necessarily have the background, there's a great challenge. And the challenge is that there is a gap between skills, i.e. Hebrew language skills, and even just knowledge of the Gemara structures, and intelligence, because people are really bright. People can be, very qualified in many spheres out there in the world. A person can have a PhD, and yet one comes into Talmud and one's starting literally from nursery school again. So the challenge over here is one can't build up from ABC. If you're going to start learning Aleph Base, the frustration of this schism between one's intellectual capacity and one's skill level will be very disheartening. So one has to find a balance, and the balance comes through using tremendous resources out there. Today, one can find almost anything in English on an app. You can have it read to you in whatever language you want. There's a website called Merkava that you can click on any word in the Talmud anywhere on the 2,711 pages, and it will translate it for you. And you can toggle a little switch that will adjust whether you want the literal translation, if you want the more expanded translation, or the full explanation. And every word you'll click on will give you that insight. The Art Scroll Talmud has changed our world in that it's given people access to the study of Talmud. I wouldn't neglect it entirely. It really depends on what stage of life a person is at, whether one wants to develop the skills, but it shouldn't get in the way. And one should also make sure that one's getting the intellectual satisfaction, because if you're not being intellectually satisfied, then the frustration will just derail you. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question sufficiently. Great. Anyone else?
I see there's one question on the chat.
Yeah, I think it's just a message. Is that a question or a message?
So the question actually came to me. Sorry, people are sending it to me privately instead of sending it. So first of all, there's and then there is, when did it start initially that women don't study Talmud, and why has it changed in our times?
Okay, that's a great question. And I would love to defer the question to my wife, because this is really a subject she's dedicated her life to, and that is to understand the role of women, their connection to Judaism, their connection to Torah, why it's changing in the modern era. The truth is that I think it's really the other way around. I think that initially women were not studying Torah, the Talmud specifically, let me correct myself. Women were not studying Talmud. They were much more in the realm of a higher level of wisdom. In fact, my wife is currently teaching a workshop about Sarah Imenu, and she quotes over there the Midrash. The Midrash says that Sarah was superior to Abraham in terms of her divine wisdom, in terms of her Ruach HaKodesh. So women for time immemorial have had a higher wisdom and a higher knowledge. That being said, the specific style and the specific structure of the Talmud was undoubtedly written for men, by men for men, but that is not to say at all that women are precluded from it. Interestingly enough, I have many women that are actually part of our academy, which is very interesting. And I think that it's a phenomenon in our generation that women have embraced the study of Talmud. If that gives a woman the satisfaction, that's great. My wife's experience is that there is a higher knowledge and that there is a deeper type of Torah that particularly resonates with many women that she is engaging with, and she's had an incredible response to it. So if it speaks to a woman, then that is a wonderful thing, and that's certainly okay. But that there are parts of Torah that are perhaps more better suited. And as I say, I would defer to my wife for further input and direction as to how to find that.
Okay, we have a question. Saul, you want to ask a question?
Yeah. So I just had the question more in reference when you mentioned the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. So yes, just to understand the difference. And the second part of the question is, over what time period was the Talmud written?
Okay, great. So the difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, I alluded to, I said it in quite more general terms. If one opens up a Jerusalem Talmud, so firstly, they don't cover exactly the same. The Mishnah consists of about 60-something, 64 books, I think, of Mishnah. And the Talmud does not, the Babylonian Talmud doesn't cover all of them. And the Jerusalem Talmud covers some of the others. So there is overlap, but there are certain areas of law that we actually need to turn to the Jerusalem Talmud. For example, the laws of Chala, we don't have a Babylonian Talmud on it. But stylistically, the Jerusalem Talmud was written in a much more halachic way, which means conclusions without letting me into the process as much of how that conclusion was drawn. And what happens is, in a sense, it's more dry, and also it's less empowering because I'm not developing necessarily the skills and the tools of how I can then be engaged in the process myself. And that has been for 1,500 years. So the answer to your question of the difference between the two would be, one is much more halachic, and the other one is much more pilpulistic, we call it, which is dialectical and backwards and forwards. So that is a major difference. And then the other difference, and then your second question was in terms of the time frames. So my history is not great, but if you saw those slides that I put up before, we're talking, they were around the same time period. I think that the Jerusalem Talmud was closed about 1,600 years ago, and the Babylonian Talmud about 1,500 years ago. We can check the exact time periods. There are very distinct eras in Jewish history where there was the period of the Amoraim. What's important to recognize is that the Talmud was only written right at the end. The entire Amoraic period, they were debating and having these discussions in the study hall, but the texts that they were working with were the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was actually only at the period of the Tanaim, and their entire period of 200 years, they weren't working with any text ostensibly. They were working with the oral law in and of itself. So that's just a broad overview. If you're interested in the Samoa, I do have another recording where I go into a little bit more detail of the interface or the interaction between the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud. There's a fascinating question about when there is some tension between them halachically, how we resolve that. And this will be part of the discussion. Great. Very good. I think that is that all for tonight, Rabbi Avtzon.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Rav. It was fantastic. And yeah,